Story number 1.
It was supposed to be an adventure, just a simple road trip, a way to break out of the monotony of my life in Tucson. My buddy Mark and I had talked about heading into the desert for months, ever since we'd watched some YouTube videos about old ghost towns and forgotten mines hidden deep in the Arizona wilderness. Mark, being a photographer, was eager to get some shots of these decaying places for his portfolio, while I was just looking for something to take my mind off of the endless routine of work. The plan was to hit the trail early, spend the day exploring, and then make it back by nightfall. Simple, right? We packed enough water and supplies for a 2-day trip, threw some camping gear in the back of my Jeep, and hit the road after sunrise. The desert around us stretched out endlessly, nothing but scrub brush and jagged rocks for miles, the sun already hot even though it was only mid-morning. Mark had done his research. He'd found this old mining town, a place that had been abandoned for over 70 years. It was off the beaten path, way out in the desert, and according to some of the locals, it was cursed. People had gone in there and never come back. There were rumors of strange noises, lights, and ghost sightings, but of course, it was all dismissed as superstition or the ramblings of drunk locals. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but something about the place intrigued me. We drove for hours, the landscape shifting from the familiar flat, barren stretches of desert to something more rugged, rocky hills and narrow canyons. The Jeep's tires kicked up dust as we followed an old dirt road that seemed to get more and more difficult to navigate. It had been a while since the last sign of civilization, and I started to feel the weight of the isolation settling in. By the time we reached the area where the town was supposed to be, the sun was starting to dip low on the horizon. The temperature had dropped slightly, but the air was still thick with heat. Heat. We parked the Jeep near a large boulder and grabbed our gear, preparing for the hike to the ghost town. I could feel the unease creeping up my spine as we began walking. The wind was still, almost too still, and the usual desert sounds, cicadas, the occasional rustle of a small animal, were absent. There was only silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to weigh down on us as we moved deeper into the desert. Mark, ever the optimist, was already talking about how the place would look in his photographs, how he could capture the decay of the buildings and the story of the people who had once lived there. We hiked for nearly an hour before we finally saw it. The town was small, a collection of decaying structures, most of them barely standing. Some looked like they had been abandoned only a few decades ago. Others had crumbled into piles of rubble. The air seemed colder here, the atmosphere thick and oppressive, and I felt my throat tighten. "Let's set up camp near that old church," Mark suggested, his voice barely breaking the silence. "It'll be perfect for the photos." I nodded, but something about the place unsettled me. There was an odd energy in the air, something I couldn't quite place, but it made my skin prickle. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. We set up our camp a few hundred yards from the church, trying to make ourselves comfortable in the harsh desert landscape. The light was fading quickly, and Mark pulled out his camera, eager to start shooting. I sat by the campfire watching the flames flicker as he disappeared into the ruins of the town. The firelight cast long shadows across the desert floor, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped even further. I stared at the fire, trying to push away the creeping sense of dread that had settled in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but the place felt wrong. Every so often, I would hear a sound in the distance, something faint like footsteps, or a low murmur carried by the wind. But when I looked up, the town was as still and empty as ever. Mark had been gone for what felt like a long time, and I started to worry. I called out his name, but there was no answer. My voice seemed to get lost in the vast emptiness of the desert, swallowed by the silence. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and made my way toward the church. As I approached, I saw Mark standing in the doorway, his back to me. He was staring into the darkness inside, unmoving. "Mark," I called again, my voice a little sharper this time. He didn't respond. I walked up behind him and tapped him on the shoulder. He didn't flinch. His body was cold to the touch, and when he finally turned to face me, his eyes were wide, unblinking, staring straight through me. "Mark, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen in place, his eyes locked on something in the distance. I followed his gaze, but all I could see was the darkened desert stretching out in front of us. "Mark?" I said again, this time more urgently. "What's going on?" He blinked once, then slowly looked at me. His face was pale, his lips trembling. I don't know," he whispered. "There's something in there, something in the church." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I saw something," Mark stammered. "There's a figure standing in the back of the church, just standing there watching me. It wasn't human. I swear it wasn't." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. I knew Mark wasn't the type to make things up, but what he was describing sounded impossible. "Come on, let's get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away, but he resisted. "No, I need to go back. I need to see it again." Before I could stop him, he pulled away and started walking toward the church again. I had no choice but to follow, my heart pounding in my chest. As we reached the doorway, I hesitated. The air inside the church felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. Mark stepped inside and I reluctantly followed. The place was pitch black except for the faint beam of light from my flashlight. The wooden pews were covered in dust and cobwebs, and the altar was long gone, leaving only the remnants of a broken cross. But it was the back of the church that caught my attention. There, in the far corner, I could make out a figure standing motionless in the shadows. I froze. "Mark, we need to leave," I whispered urgently. "Now." But Mark was already moving toward the figure. He didn't seem to hear me. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but he was stronger than I remembered. He shrugged me off and took another step toward the shadowy figure. And then, for the first time, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided toward us, its movements jerky, unnatural. The air in the church grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. I could see Mark's breath fogging in the air, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The figure emerged from the shadows, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs stretched and twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could see the outline of its jaw, thin, gaunt, and wrong. It had no eyes, only hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull the light into them, as though they were absorbing everything around them. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Mark, however, was still walking toward it, his expression vacant, his eyes glazed over. He didn't seem to understand what was happening. "Mark!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and shaking him, but it was like he didn't hear me. His body was cold, stiff, and when I looked at him again, I saw that his eyes were black, like the figure's. Before I could react, the figure reached out, its long, bony fingers wrapping around Mark's wrist. And then, without a sound, Mark's body was yanked toward it, his feet dragging across the floor. I pulled on Mark's arm with all my strength, but it was no use. He was being pulled in, like a puppet on strings, his body jerking and twitching with every movement. The last thing I saw was the figure pulling Mark into its embrace, its mouth opening wide as though to swallow him whole. I turned and ran, not looking back until I was outside, gasping for air. I don't know how I made it back to the Jeep. My mind was a blur, the desert spinning around me. I drove without stopping, heading back toward civilization, too terrified to look behind me. When I finally reached the nearest town, I called the police. They found no trace of Mark, nothing in the church or the surrounding area. It was like he had vanished. I left the desert that night, and I haven't been back since, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that figure. I still hear Mark's voice, distant and hollow, calling to me from the dark. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I've always been someone who loved the desert. Growing up in a small town near the Nevada-Arizona border, I developed a deep connection with the stark beauty of the desert landscapes, the endless sand dunes, the cracked earth, the way the sunlight dances off the rocky terrain. I'd spent countless days exploring the wide open spaces, chasing the horizon as a way to escape the noise of the world. There's something almost peaceful about the desert, something serene in its isolation. But that was before I spent a night out there alone. It was early summer when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the Arizona desert. I had spent a few nights out there before, always near familiar areas, always with a sense of security. This time, though, I was looking for something different. a new place, far away from the tourist attractions, where I could really disconnect. I had heard about a remote area not far from the infamous ghost town of Castle Dome, a place where few people dared to go due to its desolate nature and the strange stories surrounding it. The desert, they said, had a way of playing tricks on your mind. I brushed those stories off as just that, stories. There was nothing supernatural about the desert, but there was something captivating about the idea of exploring a place that no one else seemed to visit. A part of me was drawn to the unknown, to the thrill of discovering something untouched, unspoiled. I packed up my gear, loaded it into my truck, and set off in the early morning. The drive was long, the road stretching out before me with nothing but the occasional cactus or rocky outcrop to break up the monotony. By midday, I reached my destination, an isolated stretch of desert near an old mining site that had been abandoned decades ago. The ruins were barely visible from the road, hidden behind a small ridge of hills. The area was completely devoid of life, no other campers, no hikers, no sign of civilization for miles. It was exactly what I had been looking for. The air was dry and hot, but there was a strange stillness to it, a heaviness that made my skin prickle. I shrugged it off as the usual desert heat and began to set up camp. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I quickly set up my tent and began gathering firewood, the silence around me pressing in. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant calls of birds of prey. As the sun finally disappeared and the sky turned dark, I lit a small campfire. The desert night was chilly, but the fire warmed me enough to stave off the cold. I sat back, enjoying the peace, the way the fire crackled and popped as the stars above began to reveal themselves. There was something calming about it, but also something eerie. The vast expanse of the desert, with its infinite silence, made it easy to feel like I was the only person alive. I hadn't been sitting there for more than an hour when I heard the first sound, a faint rustling on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind itself, stirring the dry grass or shifting the sand. But then it came again, a soft whispering sound, like someone was talking from a great distance. I looked around, but the desert was still. There was nothing but the fire and the shadows stretching out before me. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind, but the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, until it felt as though it was right behind me. I whipped around, but the area behind my camp was still. My heart began to race, and I stood up quickly, grabbing my flashlight and scanning the area. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the barren earth. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyon walls, but there was nothing that could account for the strange sound. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But the moment I did, the whispering came again, closer this time, louder, as though someone was right there with me. It wasn't just the wind, it was a voice, a low, raspy whispering. Help me. The words were faint, barely audible, but they were clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I froze, my blood turning cold. I was alone out here. There was no one for miles. The voice came again, the words distorted by the wind. Help me. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Had I gone too long without seeing another person and was now hearing things? Maybe it was a desert mirage, some trick my mind was playing on me. But no, this felt real. It felt too real. I reached for my phone, but of course there was no signal. I was in a dead zone. Just me, the fire, and whatever was out there in the dark. I looked around again, hoping to see some explanation, but there was nothing. The desert stretched on in every direction, empty and still. I sat back down by the fire, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the voice came again, louder this time, almost desperate. Please, help me. It was coming from the direction of the old mining ruins. The wind had stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the whisper, carried across the desert in the stillness of the night. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to get up and leave, to drive away from this place as fast as I could. But another part of me, the curious part, wanted to investigate, to find out what was making that sound. It wasn't a rational decision, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, walking toward the ruins. My footsteps crunched on the dry ground as I moved slowly toward the abandoned mining site. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and the only sound was the distant howling of the wind. As I approached the ruins, the whispering grew louder, clearer. "Ah, please. I'm here." I shined my flashlight around, casting the beam over the crumbling stone buildings and rusted equipment. The place looked untouched, frozen in time. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there for years. Yet, the whispering continued, coming from within the ruins. I felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, but I pressed on. I stepped into one of the old stone buildings, my flashlight illuminating the dust-covered floor and rotting beams. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. I shone the light around, but there was nothing, no one. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the beating of my own heart. I was starting to feel ridiculous. What had I expected to find? I had been listening to a ghost story in my own head, a product of my own fear and imagination. There was nothing here, just an abandoned ruin in the desert silence. But then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, was a figure. It was standing, motionless, watching me. It was pale, almost ghostly, its features distorted in the low light. I gasped, taking a step back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was dragging itself across the floor. I could see now that it was wearing tattered clothes, the fabric shredded, as if it had been there for decades. But it wasn't just the clothes that sent a wave of terror through me. It was the eyes. Hollow, black eyes that stared at me with an intensity that felt like they were piercing into my soul. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back to my camp, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to move. The figure kept coming closer, its steps dragging through the dust, and then in a voice that was more of a rasp than a whisper, it spoke. "Help me." I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. I could feel the heat of the fire on my back, but it was nothing compared to the cold that had crept over me. I didn't know what I was looking at, whether it was a spirit, a hallucination, or something worse, but I knew I had to leave. I finally found my legs, and I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly in my hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, the ruins far behind me. I never spoke about what happened that night. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the desert had gotten to me, or maybe it was just a trick of the mind. But I know what I saw, and I will never forget the hollow eyes of that figure standing in the ruins. The desert has a way of holding on to its secrets, and some things are better left buried in the sand. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
It was late in the summer when we decided to take the trip. A group of friends, all seasoned campers, but none with real experience in the desert. It was supposed to be an adventure, a break from the routines of life in the city, a chance to get away from everything and explore the wild, untouched beauty of the Southwest. We had a truck, enough supplies to last a week, and a sense of excitement that was only dampened by the endless stretch of heat that had baked the desert floor to a hard, cracked shell. We had spent the morning in Phoenix, picking up last-minute supplies, mostly food, water, and a couple of packs of sunscreen. We weren't planning on staying in any particular park or camping site, but rather we wanted to get off the beaten path, as far away from civilization as we could. Our destination was a place called the Sonoran Desert, a vast and desolate region, its name alone a reminder of the emptiness that awaited us. There were 6 of us in total, my best friend Rachel, her cousin Peter, and the 4 of us who made up the group, me, my brother Sam, and our 2 other friends, Eric and Jill. The drive was long and monotonous, a blur of desert landscape stretching out in all directions. The only signs of life were the occasional cactus or distant jackrabbit darting across the road, its feet kicking up dust before disappearing into the brush. There was something eerie about it, the sheer emptiness, the oppressive heat, and the way the land seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached the point where we had planned to camp, the sun had already started to set, casting an orange glow across the desert. We had found a small, secluded area near a dry creek bed surrounded by tall mesas and scattered boulders. The air was thick with dust, and the temperature had dropped dramatically now that the sun was no longer beating down on us. It felt like the desert had exhaled, and we were now left in the remnants of its suffocating heat. We set up camp in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts, but as the fire crackled to life, the tension seemed to dissipate. The desert night was cold, but the fire warmed us. Rachel brought out her guitar, and we sang and joked, the sounds of our laughter echoing across the stillness. But even as we sat around the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind had started to pick up, a faint whistle growing into a steady howl that rattled the brush and made the flames of our fire dance wildly. We all tried to ignore the rising unease, but it was hard to focus. The wind was carrying with it an odd scent, something sour, like decaying vegetation. Rachel mentioned it first. "Does anyone else smell that?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. We all stopped, inhaling deeply, but no one could place it. There was something off about it, but we couldn't say what. Maybe it was just the dryness of the desert, or maybe it was the strange heat that hadn't completely left the air. Whatever it was, it lingered, and I found myself glancing around more frequently, my eyes darting to the edge of the camp, where the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. Jill suggested we take a walk after dinner, just to stretch our legs. So, without thinking too much about it, we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the desert. At first, it was peaceful, quiet, except for the sound of our footsteps and the occasional scurry of some unseen creature darting across the ground. The air was cool, and the sky above us was studded with stars, brighter than I'd ever seen them in the city. It felt like we were alone in the world. As we walked further from the camp, the silence around us deepened, and that strange, uncomfortable feeling returned. It wasn't just the quiet, it was something more. Something in the way the wind shifted, or the way the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was just the desert playing tricks on me, but then I heard it. A sound. Faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but growing louder and clearer with each passing second. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, coming from the distance. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice tight. Rachel stopped in her tracks, her face pale. "Yeah." "What is that?" The rest of us listened. There it was again, a voice, indistinct, like a chant or murmur in a language I couldn't recognize. It sounded far off, but it seemed to be coming closer, carried by the wind that was now howling around us. It was as though something, or someone, was calling to us from the dark. "That's freaky," Peter said, his voice shaky. We turned back toward the camp, quickening our pace, the light of our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the ground. The closer we got to the camp, the louder the voices became. It was impossible to ignore now. They seemed to be all around us, echoing in the distance, as though the desert itself was speaking. I felt my pulse quicken, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of my neck. We stumbled back into the camp, breathless and disoriented, only to find that the fire had gone out. The crackling embers were now little more than glowing coals, casting a faint, flickering light. The wind had died down, but the strange, distant voices persisted. It was like a whispering presence, something just beyond the reach of the light, watching us, waiting. "Did you guys put the fire out?" I asked, my voice low. "No," Sam said, his eyes wide. "It was fine when we left." We all looked around, the air heavy with something, an unease, a tension that none of us could explain. It was as though the desert itself was waiting for something to happen. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold seeping into our bones. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "No," Rachel said, shaking her head. "We're fine. It's just the wind, the desert playing tricks on us. We're okay." But her voice lacked conviction, and I could see the fear in her eyes. We all felt it, the presence, the voices. It wasn't normal. It wasn't the desert anymore. Something was out there. We packed up quickly, not even bothering to put out the fire. As we loaded the truck, the whispering grew louder, and then, as if in response, the ground beneath us seemed to rumble. It was a subtle tremor at first, barely noticeable, but it grew, becoming a deep, vibrating pulse that reverberated through the air. It felt like something was moving under the earth, something large and powerful. We jumped into the truck, not even waiting for the engine to warm up before peeling out of the camp and speeding down the dirt path. I didn't dare look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something we couldn't see, but could feel closing in. The truck bounced over the uneven terrain, and the headlights cast strange, distorted shadows on the rocks and cacti. I glanced in the rearview mirror once, but there was nothing. The desert was silent again, the voices gone. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, a small place called Quartzsite. We found a cheap motel and checked in, our nerves frayed and our minds racing. We didn't talk much about what had happened, but we all knew it. We had felt it. The desert had been watching us, and whatever had been out there wasn't finished with us. The next morning, we returned to the area to collect our gear, but it was as though the land had swallowed everything up. The camp was gone. There was no sign of where we had set up, no trace of our tents or fire pit. The ground was bare, untouched by anything we had done. It was like we had never been there at all. We left as quickly as we could, not saying a word to each other. To this day, none of us has returned to that desert. We all know what we felt, and we all know what we heard. Whatever was out there, we weren't meant to understand it, but it watched us, and I'm sure it still does. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had always been a skeptic. The kind of person who'd laugh off ghost stories with a wave of the hand or a raised eyebrow. I liked things to be grounded in logic, science, and reason. I didn't believe in anything I couldn't explain with facts, and the supernatural was firmly in the realm of fiction for me. That was until I took a solo trip through the Arizona desert, which ended up challenging every belief I thought I had. It started as an innocent adventure, a much-needed break from work and the chaos of city life. The idea was simple. Drive through the desert, camp in isolated spots, take some pictures, and get a taste of peace and solitude. Nothing too complicated. I had done similar trips before in other parts of the country, deserts, mountains, forests, but the Arizona desert was different. Something about it felt more ancient, more oppressive. But I shrugged off the unease, thinking it was just the vast emptiness of the land. I began my journey from Phoenix, driving down an old highway that stretched south toward the border. The sun was relentless, the air dry, the landscape a mosaic of red dirt and scattered cactus. It wasn't long before I hit a stretch of road where the occasional vehicle became less and less frequent. The only signs of life were the occasional lizard darting across the pavement or the distant flight of vultures circling overhead. My plan was to camp at a place called Skull Valley, a spot I had read about in a few online forums where people mentioned it being quiet, desolate, and ideal for stargazing. No one had said anything about it being haunted, but after everything that happened, I wondered why they hadn't. I found Skull Valley late in the afternoon. The road leading up to it was more of a dirt track than a proper highway, and I had to carefully navigate through a maze of rocks and sparse desert brush. When I finally arrived, I parked my truck a few hundred yards from a small ridge. The valley spread out before me like a forgotten tomb, its vast emptiness stretching on for miles. The sky was so clear it seemed like you could see every star that had ever existed, and the mountains in the distance were dusted with a strange purple hue from the setting sun. Setting up camp was simple, but as I did so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air had a kind of heaviness to it, thick and still, not like the typical desert breeze. I tried to brush it off as just the isolation getting to me, and once my camp was set, I sat down with a cold beer and began to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The landscape was bathed in orange and red as the desert began to cool, and for a moment, I thought this was why people came here, to escape the noise of the world and be alone with the vastness. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I built a small fire, its flames dancing against the dark, and I sat there alone, eating a sandwich and listening to the crackle of the wood. The sounds of the desert at night were strange, not at all like the usual chirping of insects or rustling of small animals. It was silent, but not in the peaceful way I had hoped for. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Around midnight, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel it, the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the camp, but everything was still. The wind had died down completely, and even the small fire seemed to have trouble pushing back against the oppressive quiet. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like something was out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for me to slip up, to do something wrong. I stood up and walked around the perimeter of the camp, shining my flashlight into the desert. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks, brush, and the occasional cactus. There was no sound, no movement. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I had camped in remote places before, and I knew that the desert could play tricks on your mind, especially when you were alone. But this felt different. Then I saw something, a shadow moving at the edge of my flashlight's beam. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a bobcat, but as I focused the light on it, I realized it wasn't moving like any animal I had ever seen. It was tall, too tall to be any creature native to the area. It was humanoid in shape, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. It was like watching a marionette being manipulated by invisible strings. My heart began to race. I took a step back, unsure of what I was seeing. The figure seemed to notice me, or perhaps it had been aware of me the entire time. It turned slowly, its head tilting in a way that no human being could replicate. The shadow didn't have a face, at least not one I could see clearly, but I could feel its gaze. Cold, penetrating. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking. The figure didn't move for a moment, just standing there in the darkness like it was studying me. Then it turned and began walking away, moving with that same jerky, puppet-like motion. I watched, frozen, as it disappeared into the desert. I don't know how long I stood there. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? But no, this felt real, too real. I quickly gathered up my things, stuffing them into my truck with shaking hands. I wasn't staying out there another minute. I drove off, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. The road was long, the headlights of my truck cutting through the blackness like a beacon in the night. The further I got from Skull Valley, the less I felt that presence. It was still there, just out of reach, lingering like a dark memory. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Something told me that if I did, I'd see those dark figures again, lurking just out of sight, waiting. I finally made it to a small town a few hours later, exhausted and shaken. I found a cheap motel and collapsed into the bed, the events of the night swirling in my head. I had to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow. I felt its eyes on me, watching from the dark. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I packed up and drove back to Phoenix, leaving the desert behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. It wasn't until I was back home, going through my photos, that I saw it. In the shot I had taken of the valley, right on the edge of the frame, was the shadowed figure. There was no mistaking it. Its shape was faint, almost ghostly, but unmistakable. I hadn't noticed it when I took the photo, too focused on the beauty of the landscape to notice anything else. But now it was there, clear as day, standing just outside the reach of my campfire's light. I don't know what I encountered that night in Skull Valley. I don't know if it was some kind of desert spirit, a trick of the mind, or something else entirely. But I do know that it wasn't the heat or the isolation that made me feel watched. It was something out there, something ancient that the desert had been hiding for far too long. I haven't returned to the desert since, and I doubt I ever will. Story the end.
Story number 5.
But there we were, my brother Mark and I, standing at the edge of the Arizona desert in the dead of summer, ready to set out for a weekend camping trip. Mark had always been the adventurous one, the one with the reckless curiosity. He had dragged me into this trip, promising it would be an unforgettable experience. I didn't feel the same way, but there was something about the way he talked about it, about the thrill of discovering something new, that made it hard to say no. That, and the fact that I hadn't seen him in months. He had been living in the city, working long hours at a tech company, but he had come back to visit and wanted to do something out of the ordinary. So we loaded up the truck with our gear: tents, sleeping bags, a few bottles of water, and a cooler full of food. I had my doubts, but Mark was determined. We drove out past the small towns and into the open desert, where the roads faded away into cracked earth and dry brush. The heat was oppressive, but neither of us minded. It was still early in the day, and we had plenty of daylight left to get to our campsite. We had chosen a spot near the old ruins of a ghost town. No one lived there anymore, but it was a popular spot for people looking for a little peace and quiet. It was said that the place had once been a mining town, and when the mine collapsed, it had been abandoned, the buildings left to crumble under the relentless desert sun. Over time, the wind and sand had done their work, and what remained was nothing more than a few rotting wooden structures and half-buried foundations. It didn't take long to find a place to set up camp. We found a spot near the remnants of what had once been a saloon, a crumbling skeleton of wood and stone. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, and the desert air felt thick and heavy. I could feel the weight of the silence settling over us. As we unpacked our things, Mark couldn't stop talking about the adventure we were about to have. He spoke of the history of the town, of the people who had lived there, and the tragedy that had struck. I didn't know why, but something about it all felt off. The desert had a way of making everything feel ancient, like the earth itself was holding on to secrets long buried. The hours passed slowly, and as the evening set in, the temperature dropped. We sat by the fire, sipping beer and watching the stars slowly appear above us. It was peaceful in a way. There was something hypnotic about the desert at night, the endless expanse of black sky above, and the quiet stillness all around us. But there was also something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As the night wore on, Mark's talk slowed, and we both fell into a kind of tired silence. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the brush, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, like a low murmur carried on the wind. I thought it might be the wind itself, or maybe an animal in the distance. But as I listened, the sound grew clearer. It was almost like whispering, soft and indistinct, as if someone or something was speaking in the dark, just out of reach. I looked over at Mark, but he hadn't noticed. He was staring into the fire, his face illuminated by the orange glow. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Mark didn't respond at first. He was still staring into the fire, but I could see his eyes were unfocused, distant. "Mark?" I said again, a little louder. Finally, he looked up, a confused expression crossing his face. "What?" "That sound," I said, nodding toward the darkness beyond our campfire's light. "Do you hear it?" Mark frowned, his brow furrowing. He stood up, brushing the dust off his pants. "It's just the wind, man. It's nothing." But I wasn't so sure. The sound wasn't like the wind. It was too deliberate, too structured, like something was trying to communicate. I stood up too, my feet uneasy on the desert floor, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was hard to tell. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the scrub brush, but underneath it, the whispering remained, persistent, like an insistent voice. I felt a chill run down my spine, a coldness that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Something was out there. Something wrong. "I'm going to check it out," I said. Mark shook his head. "Are you serious? It's probably just some animals, or..." But before he could finish, I was already walking away from the campfire, my feet crunching in the sand. The whispering grew louder as I moved toward the dark outline of the ruins. The air around me felt heavy, like something was pressing in on me from all sides. The wind had died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I reached the edge of the ruins and paused, scanning the dark shapes of broken walls and crumbled stone. The whispering was coming from there, from somewhere deep inside the ruins. My heart raced, but my legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the source of the sound. As I stepped into the shadows of the ruins, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The air felt colder now, like it had a bite to it, and the whispering was clearer than ever. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping, speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. I took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. In the doorway of the old saloon stood a figure, a man. At least I think it was a man. His shape was too distorted, too wrong. He was tall, impossibly thin, his clothes ragged and torn, like something out of an old Western film. But his face was the worst part. His features were twisted, pulled tight like the skin was stretched over his skull. His eyes were dark, hollow, like deep pits of blackness, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The whispering grew louder, and I could feel the voices pressing in on my mind, each one fighting to be heard. They spoke of death, of suffering, of things that had been buried here long ago, things that had never been allowed to rest. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and that's when the figure moved. Slowly, it raised one long, bony hand pointing directly at me. The whispering grew louder, and then in a voice that was not a voice but a sensation, I heard it. "Leave," it said, before it is too late. My body reacted before my mind had a chance to process. I turned and ran, faster than I had ever run in my life, back to the campfire, back to the safety of the light. I didn't stop until I was sitting next to Mark again, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. He looked at me with wide eyes, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't form words. "I saw something," I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Mark looked skeptical, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the nervous flicker in his gaze. "What did you see?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know, but it wasn't human." For the rest of the night, we didn't speak much. The air was thick with tension, and the silence between us felt oppressive. The whispering never returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, we packed up our things quickly. I didn't say anything more about what I had seen, but I knew Mark could feel it too, the weight of whatever had happened out there. We didn't talk about it when we got home either. Mark went back to his life, and I went back to mine, but I haven't forgotten. I can still hear those whispers sometimes, in the quietest moments of the night, echoing in my mind. And when the wind picks up in the desert, I still wonder if it's calling to me, if it's waiting for me to return. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The desert was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to get away from the noise of the world. My cousin Jake and I had been talking for months about going out into the Arizona desert to explore some of the old mining towns that were scattered across the landscape. Jake had recently gotten into photography, and he wanted to capture the decay of these forgotten places, the rusting remains of old equipment, the crumbling buildings overtaken by the desert. We made our plans on a whim, grab the essentials, pack up my old 4Runner, and head out. We didn't think about it much, just a spontaneous trip. The excitement of it was enough to drown out any reservations. Our plan was simple: head out, camp under the stars, and explore some ghost towns. I didn't know much about the area, but Jake had done some research. He found an old town called Vulture City, which, according to the stories, had a tragic history and a reputation for being haunted. Jake was all in. I was skeptical, but willing to go along with it. What could go wrong? We left on a Friday afternoon, just after work. The drive was longer than I had anticipated, 3 hours at least, though we stopped for gas and food along the way. By the time we reached the general area near the town, it was well past dark. The last stretch of road to Vulture City was a rough dirt path that seemed like it hadn't been maintained in years. I could feel the isolation setting in, but I didn't say anything. The landscape around us was endless, with nothing but barren desert and the occasional saguaro cactus reaching up into the inky black sky. We parked the car near a small patch of rocky ground. The desert was still, silent, and cold. The wind carried a chill that I hadn't expected, considering how hot it had been earlier in the day. Jake was immediately excited, grabbing his camera gear and heading toward the ruins. I followed behind, feeling less enthusiastic than he was, but trying not to let it show. The farther we walked into the ruins, the quieter it became. There was no sound of animals, no rustling of the wind through the brush, just silence. The buildings were what I expected, decayed, forgotten, left to rot by time and neglect. There were remnants of old wooden shacks, rusted mining carts, and broken windows. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows, making everything look just a little more sinister than it probably was. Jake wandered off to take pictures, while I stayed near the car, sitting on the hood and trying to ignore the feeling that the place was off. It wasn't just the isolation. It was something deeper, something in the air. I couldn't quite explain it, but the longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. There was something in the desert that wasn't quite right. I started to hear faint noises. It sounded like whispering, but the wind wasn't blowing enough to make the desert plants rustle. I strained my ears, trying to make out words, but the whispering stopped as soon as I focused on it. I brushed it off as nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. Jake called out from the ruins, his voice distant. "Hey, come look at this!" I got up and walked toward him, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled in. When I reached him, he was standing next to what looked like an old, collapsed house. There were several old, weathered wooden beams scattered across the ground, and behind them, there was an old stone well that had mostly caved in. Jake was peering into it through the gaps in the stone, his camera raised to his eye. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Just look," he said, his voice low. I found something strange. I stepped closer, peering into the dark void of the well. It was hard to see anything, just a few rocks scattered at the bottom, some dead leaves and debris. But as I leaned in, I saw something glinting in the faint moonlight. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the moment I did, something in the well seemed to move. Something. Dark. I pulled back quickly, a cold feeling creeping up my spine. "What the hell was that?" I muttered, my heart rate quickening. Jake didn't seem to notice my sudden unease. "It's probably just some animal, a rat or something," he said, almost dismissively. "But I'm going to get a better shot of it. There's something weird down there." He knelt down to adjust his camera, completely absorbed in his work. I stood there for a moment longer, my unease growing into full-blown anxiety. I wanted to tell Jake that we needed to leave, that something wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to. I was trying to convince myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. We stayed there for another hour, Jake getting shot after shot of the ruins and the well, while I sat nearby, barely able to shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't until the wind picked up, howling across the desert, that Jake finally suggested we set up camp. I didn't argue. We found a small clearing not far from the ruins and set up our tent. The wind was starting to bite, and I couldn't shake the oppressive silence of the place. I kept imagining I heard something. Footsteps, distant voices, a soft rustling like someone moving around in the dark. But every time I looked out into the desert, there was nothing, just darkness. We tried to sleep, but it was difficult. The air was too cold, and every noise made my heart race. Jake slept soundly, his deep breaths echoing in the quiet. I, on the other hand, lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. At one point, I thought I heard someone whisper my name, soft and distant. I jerked upright, but there was no one there. I looked around the tent, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway, but nothing was there. It was as if the desert itself had swallowed every sound. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Jake packing up his gear. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. The desert looked much less threatening in the daylight, but the unease I'd felt the night before lingered. Jake seemed oblivious to the strange atmosphere. "Hey, I want to go back to the well and get a few more shots before we head back," he said, his voice chipper. I nodded, still feeling off, but not wanting to admit to him how uneasy I was. We packed up the rest of our gear and made our way back to the ruins. As we approached the well, something caught my eye, a dark figure in the distance. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was moving in our direction. "Jake," I said, my voice tight, "do you see that?" Jake followed my gaze, squinting. "Yeah, I think it's just a hiker or something. Probably someone else exploring the area." I didn't know what it was, but it didn't look like a person to me. It was tall, thin, and it moved in a strange, jerky way, like it wasn't walking but gliding across the ground. I felt my stomach turn. "Let's just get back to the car," I said, my voice shaking. Jake looked at me, puzzled. "What's wrong?" Just trust me," I said, my voice low. We turned to leave, but as we did, I saw the figure again, closer this time, and I could swear I saw it smiling at us. A smile that was too wide, too wrong. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the Forerunner. He didn't argue, sensing the urgency in my movements. We climbed into the car, and I started the engine, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't look back. As we drove away, I could feel the weight of the desert pressing on me, as though something was following us. I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. We never spoke about it again, but I don't think either of us ever really forgot what happened out there. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry desert floor. The temperature, which had been unbearable just hours before, began to drop, the cold air creeping in with the darkness. My friends and I had been hiking in the Arizona desert for the better part of the day, following a trail that was less of a path and more of a suggestion. It had been a rough journey, but the promise of a secluded campsite under the stars had kept us going. There were 5 of us: myself, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Emily, and 2 other guys, Chris and Brian. We'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to escape the noise and chaos of the city. None of us were particularly experienced with desert camping, but we figured it couldn't be that difficult, right? How hard could it be to find a spot to set up a few tents in the desert? By the time we reached the area we had decided to camp, the sun had already slipped beneath the horizon, leaving us with only the dim light of our headlamps. It was a little disorienting being out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the wide, empty desert stretching around us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it to the others. Jake, ever the optimist, was already unpacking the gear, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Look at this place. We've got it all to ourselves," he said, throwing his arms wide to gesture at the endless expanse of desert around us. I wasn't so sure. The land around us seemed too quiet. There wasn't the usual chirping of crickets or the rustling of small animals in the bushes. Even the wind, which had been so persistent during the day, had quieted down, leaving only the strange stillness. But we got to work, setting up the tents and gathering firewood. It wasn't until we had the campfire blazing that I started to feel more at ease. There's something comforting about the crackling warmth of a fire when you're out in the wilderness, something that makes the vastness of the desert seem less oppressive. We ate dinner, laughed, and talked as the sky darkened and the stars began to come out. The air grew colder, but we didn't mind. I found myself enjoying the quiet for the first time in days. After weeks of working long hours and dealing with the stress of life, it felt good to sit back and unwind. It wasn't until later that night that things started to get strange. I don't know when it began, exactly. Maybe it was when the wind picked up again, or maybe it was when we all started to feel it. A sudden drop in temperature that made the desert night seem even colder than it should have been. The fire seemed to flicker erratically, as if it were struggling against something. But it wasn't the fire that made me feel uneasy. It was the quiet. I don't know if anyone else noticed it at first, but I could feel it in the air. The oppressive weight of something unseen, something watching us from the dark. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the conversation. We were talking about old ghost stories we had heard growing up, trading tales of haunted houses and strange occurrences. Brian had just finished telling a particularly creepy story about a house on the outskirts of town when we all heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. At first it was faint, a rustling, like the sound of something moving through the brush. But it was coming from a direction we hadn't noticed before. It wasn't the desert wildlife. This was something heavier, something that moved with purpose. The rustling grew louder, and the others heard it too. They all turned their heads in the direction of the sound, their expressions darkening. "What is that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling just a little. "I don't know," Jake said, his brow furrowing. He stood up and grabbed his flashlight. "I'll go check it out." "No, wait," I said, grabbing his arm before he could take a step. "We don't know what it is. Maybe we should just stay by the fire." But he shook me off and headed toward the edge of the camp, his light sweeping through the dark desert. I watched him for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest, before I turned to the others. They all looked as uneasy as I felt. It was Brian who spoke up first. "Maybe it's just a coyote or something. They're around here." I didn't believe that. Coyotes don't make that kind of noise, especially not in the middle of the night, when everything is still. It wasn't just the noise that bothered me, it was the feeling that had settled over me. The air felt thicker, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Jake called back from the edge of the camp, his voice carrying on the wind. "There's nothing out here, just some rocks." I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when we heard it again, a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a whisper, coming from the same direction Jake had gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. This wasn't right. Jake's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw something in the beam. A shape, tall, dark, and indistinct, looming just beyond the range of the light. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. "Jake?" I called out, but my voice cracked. Something was wrong. There was a moment of silence, and then Jake's voice came back to us, but this time it was different. It was strained, tight, as if he was trying to keep his cool but failing. "Guys, get over here. Now." Without thinking, I jumped up, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground as I rushed toward the sound of his voice. Emily, Brian, and Chris followed close behind. We reached the spot where Jake had been standing, but there was no sign of him. Just the eerie quiet of the desert, broken only by the sound of the wind. "Jake?" I called out, my heart racing. "Jake, where are you?" No answer. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something in the air, something that wasn't natural. I felt like we were being watched. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, moving quickly, too quickly. They were coming from behind me, and when I turned around, I saw something moving in the dark, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't make out its shape, but I could feel the eyes on me, the gaze of something cold and ancient. "Run!" I shouted, turning and grabbing Emily's hand. "Run!" We bolted back toward the camp, our feet kicking up the dry sand as we sprinted. The others were close behind. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. I glanced back, and for just a moment I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, with long bony arms that reached out toward us. We didn't stop running. We didn't even slow down. By the time we reached the camp, Jake had already arrived, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice breathless. "Now." Without hesitation, we packed up our things as quickly as possible, the desert cold seeping into our bones as we scrambled to get everything together. I don't know how we did it, but we managed to get everything into the truck. We didn't say much. There was no need to. We all knew what had happened. As we drove back through the desert, the headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless stretch of sand. I glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that figure following us. But there was nothing. Just the dark, empty desert. We didn't speak for the entire drive back. No one said a word about what we had seen or thought we had seen, but we all knew that something in the desert had been watching us. And whatever it was, it didn't want us there. We never went back. And to this day, none of us talks about that night. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the footsteps behind me in the desert, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was early spring when my friends and I decided to take a trip out into the desert. We'd been planning it for months. We all lived in Phoenix, and we needed a break from the noise of city life. The desert, vast and silent, seemed like the perfect place to escape. We figured we could camp under the stars, hike through some of the ancient canyons, and visit a couple of ghost towns. The plan seemed simple enough, and no one was concerned about the eerie stories we'd heard about the desert. It was just a place to unwind. There were 4 of us. Me, my childhood friend Alex, his cousin Ben, and our friend Rachel. We all shared a similar love for adventure, though none of us had spent much time out in the desert. But the more we talked about it, the more excited we got. We'd be exploring the remnants of old mining towns, long-forgotten places that had stories to tell. Our main destination was a place called the Lost Mine. It was said to be hidden somewhere deep in the Arizona desert, an old gold mine that was abandoned in the early 1900s. The weather was perfect when we started the trip. We packed our gear into my Jeep, tents, sleeping bags, food, and plenty of water. We had a couple of GPS devices, but honestly, they didn't work out there. We figured we'd just use them to get as close as possible and then rely on our instincts and a few trail markers. The drive was long, the desert stretching out for miles in all directions, an endless sea of sand and rock. As we got farther from civilization, the isolation of it all started to settle in. There was nothing out there. No signs of life, no buildings, just the occasional cactus or rocky outcrop. The air was dry, the sun blinding as it hung low in the sky. We stopped at a small roadside gas station to stock up on supplies, and when we spoke to the attendant, he gave us a strange look. You guys heading to the Lost Mine? He asked, his voice low. We nodded, unsure of what to say. We'd heard rumors, but nothing concrete. Well, he said, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for someone, you might want to think twice. People who go there, they don't always come back. We all laughed nervously, brushing it off as local superstition. The guy seemed harmless, but there was an odd chill in his voice that I couldn't ignore. Thanks for the heads up, Alex said, and we left the station. None of us mentioned it again, but that conversation lingered in the back of my mind. The road we followed eventually turned into a dirt path. There were no signs of human presence, and the terrain got rougher. The wheels of the Jeep kicked up dust, and the only sound was the humming of the engine. I had an odd feeling that we were being watched, though I couldn't shake the sensation. I chalked it up to the vast emptiness of the desert. We parked the Jeep a mile or so from the mine's supposed location, setting up camp just as the sun started to set. The air was cooling, and we could see the stars starting to appear above us. It was beautiful, silent and still, but the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the earth itself was holding its breath. We spent the evening around the campfire, eating, joking, and telling ghost stories about places just like this, about ancient spirits who roamed the desert, restless and angry. Rachel was the most into the stories, and she started telling us about a legend she had read online. It was about a miner who had gone mad out there, believing that the desert was alive. He had dug for gold for years, but the gold never came. He had fallen in love with the idea of treasure, but soon he became obsessed. People said he started talking to the rocks, believing they were talking back to him. Eventually, he vanished, and some said his ghost still wandered the desert, searching for the gold that never existed. I've heard that story, Ben said, throwing a log onto the fire. They say that his ghost is still out here, lost and angry. He tries to lure people into the desert with promises of riches, but it always ends in death. We laughed, but the laughter felt hollow. There was a sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't just the darkness or the isolation or the desert's silence. It was something deeper, something more primal. I glanced around at my friends, all of them visibly unsettled by the conversation. I shook it off and suggested we get some rest. The night was cold, the fire crackling as we all crawled into our tents. I couldn't sleep. The quiet of the desert felt oppressive, as if the very land itself was waiting. My mind kept drifting back to the stories, the warnings from the gas station attendant, and the eerie way the desert seemed to swallow every sound. Every time the wind would shift, I thought I heard whispers, faint, barely perceptible. The sound was always just at the edge of my hearing, and when I would focus on it, it would disappear. Around midnight, I decided to step outside for a few minutes. The air was cold, and the sky was filled with a blanket of stars. As I stood there, I could see the outlines of the jagged mountains in the distance. There was something in the air, something that made my skin crawl. The desert, vast and empty, felt alive, like it was watching me. That's when I heard it. At first, it was a faint noise, almost like someone crying out in the distance. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the direction of the mine. A voice low and mournful, calling out, almost pleading. My heart started to race, and I felt a chill run through me. I ran back to the tents, waking up the others. "Did you hear that?" I asked, breathless. But none of them had heard anything. They were all still half asleep, confused. Rachel looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "It's probably just an animal," she said. "Some coyote or something." But I wasn't convinced. I knew what I'd heard. It wasn't an animal. We stayed up for a while longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept thinking about the stories, the one the gas station attendant had told us, the legend of the lost miner. And then, without warning, I felt it. A sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like something was lurking just outside the glow of the firelight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was watching us. Eventually, I gave in to exhaustion. I lay down in my tent, trying to push the fear aside, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of a figure standing just beyond the firelight, watching us. It was always the same, tall, thin, with hollow, sunken eyes, staring directly at me. The next morning, I woke up to find my friends already packing up the campsite. They were talking about moving to the mine itself to check it out. We weren't far from it, and they all seemed excited. But I was too shaken to be enthusiastic. I told them that I wanted to leave, that I didn't feel right about staying any longer. But they didn't understand. We hiked the short distance to the mine, passing a few old structures along the way. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we reached the mine, I felt it even more strongly, the sense that something was wrong. As we stood there looking into the dark, empty shaft, I heard it again, the whispering like voices carried on the wind, but it wasn't the wind, it was coming from the mine. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice tight. We all froze, listening. The whispering grew louder, but it didn't sound like words. It sounded like laughter, low, mocking, and haunting. "I don't like this," Rachel said, backing away. But it was too late. The earth beneath us seemed to shift, and then, all at once, the wind kicked up violently. Sand and dust swirled around us, stinging our faces. The laughter grew louder, almost deafening. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, turned, and ran back toward the campsite without saying a word. The others followed, but I was too frantic to slow down. I didn't care what they thought of me. All I cared about was getting out of that cursed place. When we made it back to the Jeep, I didn't look back. We packed up and left the desert in a hurry, never once stopping until we were miles away. The sounds, the whispers, the laughter, all of it faded as we drove, but the feeling didn't leave me. That was the last time I went into the desert, and I haven't returned since. Years have passed, but I still remember the look on Alex's face when he turned to me and said, "You were right. We shouldn't have gone there." Story. The end.
Story number 9.
I had always been fascinated by the desert. There was something about the vast emptiness of it, the way it stretched on forever, that both frightened and intrigued me. The desert holds secrets, ancient things that have been buried beneath the sands for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. I had read countless stories about ghost towns and strange occurrences in the desert, but I never thought I would be the one to experience something unexplainable. That was until I ventured into the Arizona desert on a solo camping trip. I was an experienced camper and hiker, so I wasn't particularly worried about the isolation. I had spent countless nights in remote locations, far away from the distractions of the modern world, just me and nature. I had heard of the so-called haunted areas of the desert, places where strange things had happened, where people claimed to have seen or heard things they couldn't explain. But I never took them seriously. To me, they were just stories, fabrications meant to add an eerie charm to an already eerie place. That all changed during my trip to the desert. I had driven for hours through the Arizona wilderness, past dry, cracked earth and sparse vegetation, until I finally reached a place known as the Devil's Desert. It was a remote area, far off the beaten path, where few people ventured. There were stories about the place. Some said it was cursed, others believed it was the site of ancient rituals. But I didn't care. I was there for the solitude, the chance to disconnect from the world and clear my mind. I had read about a secluded canyon where I could set up camp, and that's where I was headed. By the time I arrived at the canyon, the sun was beginning to set. The shadows stretched long across the desert floor, and the air had a slight chill to it. The place was even more desolate than I had imagined, a barren landscape of cracked earth and jagged rocks. There were no signs of life, no animals, no people, just silence. The kind of silence that wraps around you and makes everything feel still, almost unnervingly so. I set up my tent quickly, eager to settle in before the darkness fully descended. The wind had picked up, howling through the canyon walls, and I could hear the rustle of dry leaves and small stones being kicked up by the gusts. The fire I built crackled loudly, its orange flames dancing in the cool night air. It was peaceful, in a way, but there was something in the atmosphere that made me uneasy, something I couldn't quite place. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I wrapped myself in a thick jacket and sat close to the fire, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off. I had been alone in the wilderness before, but this time felt different. The silence was oppressive, like the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to push the thought from my mind, focusing instead on the flickering flames and the stars above, which were beginning to emerge in the dark sky. Around midnight, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but it was enough to make me pause. I looked around, but the desert was as empty and still as it had been when I first arrived. No signs of life, no movement, just the sound of the wind. I chalked it up to my imagination, maybe a trick of the desert wind, but the feeling of unease lingered. I tried to push it aside, convincing myself that it was nothing, just the desert playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, closer, like someone whispering just behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. "Hello?" I called out into the night, my voice shaking. "Is anyone out there?" No answer, just the wind. I stood up, my instincts on high alert. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was the wind again, or perhaps an animal moving through the brush. But it didn't feel like that. It felt wrong. I felt exposed, like I was being watched, like there was something just beyond the firelight, waiting for me to make a mistake. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around me, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the rocks and sand stretching out before me. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the canyon walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me. I decided to take a walk around the camp, hoping the movement would calm my nerves. I walked in a slow circle, keeping close to the light of the fire, but as I moved farther from the camp, I noticed something strange: footprints in the sand. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still crisp, as though someone had walked there recently. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no one else around, no sign of any other campers or hikers. The closest town was miles away. I knelt down to inspect the footprints. They were strange, too large to be from a regular animal, and the shape was wrong, too symmetrical, almost as if they had been deliberately made. I scanned the area around me, but there was nothing, no one. The wind had picked up again, howling through the canyon, and I could hear the distant rustling of dry leaves and the creaking of old branches. The footprints led off into the distance, disappearing into the dark. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood up slowly, my pulse racing in my chest. The desert, so vast and empty, suddenly felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. I turned and made my way back to the camp, my mind racing with possibilities. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, that the footprints could have been made by anything, a person, an animal, a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I sat back down by the fire, I noticed something even more unsettling. The fire had started to flicker and die down, as though something was drawing the energy from it. I leaned forward, trying to feed more wood into the flames, but the fire didn't respond. It sputtered and flickered, casting shadows across the canyon walls. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the camp just beyond the firelight. It was tall, its form indistinct, but there was something undeniably human about it. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, staring at the shape. It was standing still, watching me, its eyes glinting in the low light. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The figure remained motionless, its presence filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, and shone the beam toward the figure. But when the light hit it, the figure was gone. The spot where it had been standing was empty, the sand undisturbed. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I had to be imagining things, right? Maybe it was a trick of the firelight, or maybe I had fallen asleep without realizing it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't been dreaming. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed my gear into my bag. The desert had always seemed so vast and endless, but now it felt like a prison, like the walls were closing in on me. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. As I hurriedly broke down my camp, I could hear the whispers again, faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind. They grew louder, closer, until it felt like the voices were right behind me, urging me to leave, to run. I didn't need any more encouragement. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to my truck, not looking back. When I finally reached my truck, I got inside, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could. The desert that had once felt so vast and empty now seemed oppressive, like it was following me, like it wanted to swallow me whole. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small, rundown place with a gas station and a diner. I checked into a motel, my mind racing with what had happened. I tried to tell myself that it was just a trick of the mind, that the desert had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. The desert had shown me something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for someone to stumble across it. And now, I would never forget it. Story the end.
Story number 10.
We had been driving for hours, the endless desert stretching before us like an ocean of sand and rock. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the landscape, but the heat still clung to the air. It was late October, but here in the Arizona desert, it might as well have been the middle of summer. It was me, my brother Sam, and our two friends, Alex and Ben. We had made this trip before, but it had always been a quick visit, just a weekend here and there. This time, we had more time to explore. Sam, the one with the most experience in the desert, had suggested we take a more remote route, further away from the popular tourist spots. The plan was to find a secluded area to camp for the night and do a little stargazing. None of us were particularly worried about safety, though I had my reservations. There's always something unsettling about the desert, something primal that makes you feel small and insignificant. The road we were on was barely a road at all, just a dirt path that had been carved into the land over years of use by those willing to risk it. It was the kind of road that didn't show up on maps, the kind that looked like a forgotten afterthought. The landscape around us was stark. Jagged rocks, dry brush, and the occasional twisted, windswept cactus. I couldn't help but feel like we were intruding in a place that wasn't meant for us. The sun was almost gone when we finally found a spot. It was a small canyon surrounded by towering cliffs of weathered sandstone. The shadows were long, the temperature already beginning to drop, and the wind was picking up, kicking up the dust into swirling clouds. Despite the oppressive heat, there was a chill in the air now. Sam pulled the truck to a stop, and we all piled out, eager to stretch our legs. "This is it," Sam said, grinning. "It's perfect." Ben looked around, his face scrunched in a way that I could tell he was uneasy. "I don't know, man. This place feels off." Alex, ever the optimist, slapped Ben on the back. "You're just being paranoid. It's a desert. It's supposed to feel empty." I didn't say anything, but I had to admit I agreed with Ben. The air felt heavy, thick, like the land itself was holding its breath. Still, I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I just followed the others as they began unloading the gear from the truck. We set up camp just as the sky turned a deep purple, the stars slowly starting to emerge one by one. It was breathtaking. The desert at night is something else, quiet, still, and vast, the sky seeming to stretch on forever. We built a fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the otherwise silent desert. Sam had brought his guitar, and for a while, we all sat around the fire, talking and laughing. As the night wore on, though, something changed. The wind, which had been steady at first, died down and the temperature dropped sharply. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. Ben was the first to notice it. "You guys feel that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight. "What?" Sam asked, looking up from his guitar. "I don't know," Ben said, looking around. "It just got quiet. Too quiet." I looked around. The desert was always quiet, but this was different. It was as if all the usual desert sounds, the rustling of small animals, the wind moving through the rocks, had just stopped. I could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire, the silence pressing in around us. "Yeah, I feel it too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the whole desert is holding its breath." "Shut up," Alex said with a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "You're all freaking yourselves out. It's just the desert. We've been here before." But even his words didn't seem to carry the same weight they normally did. There was a tension in the air, something I couldn't explain, and it made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. But I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to be the one to make it worse. We sat there in silence for a while longer, the fire casting flickering shadows on the faces of my friends. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A noise. Faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder. It sounded like a voice, but it was distorted, as if coming from far away or muffled by a wall. It was a low, guttural sound, something that didn't belong in the quiet of the desert. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Sam was already standing up, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice didn't sound so sure. But the noise continued, faint at first, and then louder, clearer. A voice. It was almost a chant, a rhythmic sound that felt like it was coming from all around us. I could feel it in my bones, this strange vibration in the air. "Okay, this is weird," Alex said, standing up now too. "We're not alone out here." "Shut up," Sam said, though his voice sounded strained now. He was trying to convince himself as much as anyone. "It's nothing." But the sound didn't stop. It was growing louder, and I could hear distinct words now, though they were in a language I didn't recognize. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath catching in my throat. Ben was the first to break the silence. "We need to get out of here." "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." We quickly packed up the camp, trying not to look over our shoulders, but the whispering was getting closer. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I could feel it all around us. The air felt thick with it, like it was closing in on us. Sam was in a hurry now, his usually calm demeanor shaken. We were about halfway through packing when the whispering suddenly stopped, and in the stillness, something else happened. I felt it before I heard it, like the ground under my feet shifted, like the very earth was trembling. Then came the sound of something heavy, something large, moving in the distance. A slow, deliberate step, like something massive was walking toward us. It was too loud to be an animal, and too slow to be a person. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. We all heard it now, and we were all frozen in place. The steps grew louder, closer, each one thundering in the silence. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps, it was something else, something that felt ancient, something that had been here long before we arrived. Without a word, Sam grabbed the last of the gear and we sprinted back to the truck. We didn't look back. We couldn't. The desert was silent once again as we drove away, the only sound the tires crunching against the sand. But in the distance, just behind us, I could have sworn I saw something moving. A figure, tall and dark, standing against the backdrop of the night. I didn't say anything, and neither did the others. We all knew what we had heard, what we had felt. And we all knew that something had followed us out of the desert that night. We made it to the nearest town, shaken and exhausted. None of us spoke much about it. There was no need to. We all felt the same way. The desert had given us a glimpse into something we weren't meant to understand, and we had barely escaped. To this day, none of us have returned to the desert. We still talk about it sometimes, but only in whispers, late at night when the wind howls outside. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me through the dark. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
We had been planning this trip for months, and I still wasn't sure why I agreed to it. The idea of camping in the desert had always seemed like something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. My friend Mark had always been a fan of the unknown, the eerie, and the unexplained. And this time, he managed to convince me to join him and our other friends for a weekend camping trip in the southern Arizona desert. Our goal was to visit a place called the Ghost Ranch, a site rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who once lived there, a place that many locals warned us to avoid. Mark had heard about the ranch from a friend who swore he had seen strange lights and heard whispers in the night when he camped there years ago. He was convinced that we could experience something extraordinary if we spent the night there. As someone who wasn't easily frightened, I wasn't about to let Mark go alone, so I reluctantly agreed. The rest of the group, John, Sarah, and Ben, didn't seem all that worried either. None of us knew much about the ranch other than the creepy stories we had heard, but that only seemed to make it more exciting. We set out in 2 cars, heading towards the outskirts of the desert around late afternoon, just as the sun started to dip lower in the sky. The desert was beautiful in its desolation, the wide open spaces, the jagged rocks, the occasional cactus. The scenery was captivating, and as the sun painted the landscape in shades of orange and pink, I couldn't help but feel like we were leaving behind the world we knew. The air was dry, the wind was cool, and the only sounds were those of our tires crunching over the gravel road. The drive took us deeper into the desert, and before long the landscape turned from peaceful to stark and eerie. The ranch was located near the remnants of an old mining town, which had long since been abandoned. The road became narrow, rough, and barely visible in places. It was clear that no one had ventured out this way for years. As we neared our destination, the sun finally set, and the desert night wrapped itself around us, the stars appearing in the sky like scattered diamonds. We arrived at the ranch just as it grew completely dark. The place was as deserted as I expected. No other campers, no vehicles, just the eerie remnants of what had once been a thriving settlement. The buildings were falling apart, their wood cracked and weathered, their windows shattered or completely gone. It was the kind of place where you could feel history in the air, but not in a romantic sense. It felt more like the weight of forgotten lives, like the land was keeping secrets, stories buried deep within the earth. We parked and began setting up camp. Mark was already on edge, excited yet apprehensive, his eyes scanning the ruins as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. John, who was the most skeptical of all of us, made a joke about how he hoped the ghosts had Wi-Fi. We laughed, but the sound of our voices felt oddly out of place in such a silent environment. As we set up our tents, Sarah and Ben wandered off, exploring the remains of an old building that seemed to have once been a small store or gathering place. Mark and I stayed near the fire pit, unpacking our gear. By the time we finished setting up camp, it was pitch black. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the distinct smell of dust and dry earth. We built a fire and gathered around it, its flickering light casting shadows that danced and swirled in the desert air. For a while, everything was peaceful, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. We sat in silence for a while, but it wasn't the kind of silence you feel when you're surrounded by nature. This was different, an unnatural kind of stillness. It felt as though the air was thick, like something was waiting, something unseen. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine, chalking it up to the stories we'd been told about the place. After a while, we started talking about the ghost stories surrounding the ranch. Mark was the first to bring it up. He had heard that the area was once home to a group of settlers who had mysteriously disappeared under strange circumstances. Some said they had been killed in an attack by hostile Native Americans, while others claimed that they had vanished due to some sort of supernatural force. Some people say they still haunt this place, Mark said, his voice low. There are stories about people hearing whispers in the wind, voices that aren't human. And the lights. Some people have said they've seen strange lights floating around the ranch at night, like the ghosts of the settlers trying to lead you somewhere. John scoffed. Oh, please. There's always a story like that for every old place. Ghost lights, whispers, it's all just the wind in your imagination. But even as he said that, I noticed the way he glanced around, his eyes darting into the dark shadows of the ruins. We spent the next few hours telling stories and making light of the situation, but I could tell that we were all a little on edge. As the fire began to die down, we started to hear things, faint rustlings, creaks, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. At first, I dismissed it as an animal, but when I turned to look, I saw nothing but darkness stretching out before me. Then, just as I was beginning to feel the unease settle in, I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind us, from the direction of the ruins. It was so soft that I thought I had imagined it at first, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. Help? I froze, my blood running cold. It was a woman's voice, distant, almost pleading. I turned to Mark, but he hadn't heard it. John and Ben were still sitting, oblivious to the sound. Only Sarah seemed to sense something was wrong. She had stood up and was staring toward the ruins, her face pale in the firelight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone fell silent, straining to hear. The wind had died down completely, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. And then, from deep in the ruins, we heard it again. A voice. "Help me." This time, it was clearer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Mark was the first to speak. "It's just the wind, or some animal. Maybe a coyote or something." But I knew better. It didn't sound like any animal. It didn't even sound like the wind. It sounded human. Ben and John were already standing up, looking nervously in the direction of the ruins. "I don't like this," Ben muttered. "Let's go back to the car." But Sarah didn't want to leave. "We have to check it out. Maybe someone's really out there." We all looked at each other, unsure. But curiosity and the strange, magnetic pull of the unknown was enough to get us moving. Sarah, with her flashlight, led the way toward the ruins, with the rest of us following reluctantly behind. As we walked closer, the temperature seemed to drop. I don't know how to explain it, but the air felt colder as we neared the buildings. There was an oppressive heaviness in the atmosphere, like the land itself was holding its breath. The darkness of the ruins swallowed us as we stepped into it, and the beam of Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice shaky. There was no answer, just the wind whistling through the broken windows. We crept farther in, my eyes scanning every corner, every dark crevice. Then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the room. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out the shape of a person, their outline faint but real. I froze, and so did everyone else. Sarah's voice trembled as she called out again, "Hello?" The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at us. And then, without warning, it vanished. Just like that, it disappeared into the shadows. I don't know how long we stood there in the dark, our breaths shallow, our hearts racing. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. We all felt it, the presence that was still there, lingering, watching. Finally, Sarah turned and walked quickly toward the exit track, the rest of us following close behind. As we ran back to the campsite, I glanced back one last time, and for just a split second, I saw the figure again, standing at the window, watching us. We didn't sleep that night. None of us. The silence outside the tent felt suffocating, and the whispers continued to haunt me, the faintest sounds carried on the wind just beyond my reach. The next morning, we left. We didn't pack up the way we had planned. We didn't say anything to each other. We just got in the cars and drove as fast as we could, leaving the ranch and the desert behind. None of us spoke about what happened until we were far away, miles from the ghost ranch. We couldn't explain it, but none of us ever went back. Story the end.